In the autumn of 1887, a schoolteacher from Ohio arrived in a mountain valley that did not appear on any official map. The people there greeted him by name before he had introduced himself. That was unsettling enough. What truly frightened him was the small wooden plaque hanging above the village well. Carved into the weathered wood was a date from 3 weeks in the future, and beneath it, his full name. There are forgotten towns in every country, places hidden by forests, rivers, or the simple indifference of history. Most disappear because people leave them. This one survived because nobody could. The residents of Gray Hollow believed that every person who entered the valley arrived with a name already written somewhere in the mountains. They did not know who wrote the names, and they did not ask. They only knew that the valley had never been wrong. When Elias Mercer stepped off the stagecoach carrying a leather satchel filled with lesson plans and grammar books, he thought he had come to teach children for a winter term. Instead, he walked into a place that had been waiting for him long before he was born. The road that bent away. Elias had accepted the teaching position because it paid $2 more per week than his school in Columbus. The letter offering the job had arrived without a return address. It described a valley beyond the Allegheny Ridges, a farming community in need of a teacher, and a schoolhouse that stood empty after the previous instructor vanished during the spring thaw. The journey took 4 days by rail and another 2 by stagecoach. On the final evening, rain swept across the mountains in gray curtains. The coach driver, a silent man named Boone, kept glancing toward the western ridges as if expecting something to emerge from the fog. "We'll stop at Dunmar by nightfall," Elias said, consulting the map folded in his lap. Boone spat into the rain. "No, sir. Dunmar's east of here." Elias frowned. "Then where are we?" "Closer than we ought to be." Before Elias could ask another question, the horses turned onto a narrow road hidden between 2 walls of stone. The map showed nothing there. The road twisted upward through dense pine forest, climbing until the air grew sharp and cold. Then, without warning, the trees opened. A valley spread below them. Fields of amber grass rolled toward a cluster of wooden houses. Thin columns of smoke rose from chimneys. A river curved through the center like a strip of tarnished silver. Beyond it stood a church with a black steeple and, farther still, a schoolhouse painted white. Boone pulled the horses to a stop. "This is Gray Hollow," he said. "I don't see it on my map." "That's because maps don't care for places that remember too much." Elias laughed uneasily, assuming it was mountain superstition. He reached for his satchel, but Boone caught his sleeve. "One thing," the driver said quietly. "If they ask whether you've seen your name, don't answer until you know what they mean." Then he released him, turned the coach around, and disappeared into the rain without waiting for payment. Elias stood alone on the muddy road. A woman holding a lantern approached from the nearest house. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair streaked silver at the temples. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "We were beginning to worry. You know who I am?" "Of course. I'm Martha Hale, the school trustee. Welcome to Gray Hollow." She spoke as though his arrival had been scheduled with absolute certainty. As they walked through the village, people looked up from porches and doorways. None seemed surprised to see him. A blacksmith nodded and said, "Evening, Mr. Mercer." A boy carrying a bucket grinned and waved. An old woman sitting beneath an elm tree whispered, "3 weeks early." Elias tried to convince himself that Martha had simply announced his arrival in advance. Yet when they reached the village well, his steps slowed. Above the well hung a wooden plaque. Carved into it were the words, October 29th, 1887. #### Elias Mercer. The river will remember. The date was 23 days away. "What is this?" he asked. Martha's expression did not change. "Your notice." "Notice of what?" "That depends on the river." #### Part 2. The empty desk. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of the valley, facing the river. Inside, 12 desks formed neat rows around a cast-iron stove. A layer of dust covered the teacher's table. "You haven't had classes since spring?" Elias asked. "The children still come," Martha said. "They simply haven't had a teacher." "What happened to the last one?" Martha removed a key from her pocket and unlocked a small cabinet behind the desk. Inside lay a stack of attendance books and a single silver pocket watch. His name was Nathan Bell, she said. One morning he walked to the river and did not return. Did anyone search for him? For 7 days. And we found the watch. She handed it to Elias. The watch was stopped at 3:17. The children arrive at dawn. Martha continued. Your room is upstairs. Supper will be brought shortly. Mrs. Hale, Elias said, that plaque by the well. You should rest. Travelers ask many questions on their first night. She left before he could press her further. After supper, Elias unpacked his books and lit an oil lamp. Wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in the valley, a church bell rang once, though the church was dark. Near midnight, he noticed something scratched into the underside of the teacher's desk. If you find your name twice, leave before the second sunrise. The handwriting was hurried and uneven. Elias stared at the words until the lamp flame flickered low. Then he heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, one step at a time. He opened the door. No one stood there. Only a wet footprint on the wooden floor. Hashtag part 3. The Children of Gray Hollow. The next morning, 12 children were waiting outside the schoolhouse before sunrise. They ranged from 6 to 16 years old, dressed in patch coats and boots still damp with dew. When Elias introduced himself, they answered in unison. We know. The oldest girl, Clara Reed, handed him a bundle of papers. These are the names for today, she said. Elias unfolded the sheets. They contained attendance lists, but beside each student's name was a strange notation. Name Mark. Clara Reed, 37. Thomas Pike, 12. Luigi Halle Kirkbeef. Edwin Cole, 3. What do these numbers mean? He asked. Several children exchanged glances. Finally, a small boy named Edwin said days. Days until what? No one answered. Lessons began awkwardly. The children were intelligent, but they treated certain subjects strangely. They excelled at arithmetic and geography, yet refused to discuss future tense verbs. When Elias asked Clara to conjugate to go, she said, go. I went, and I will go. Clara lowered her eyes. We don't say that here. During the midday break, Elias walked to the river. The water moved quietly between dark stones. On the opposite bank stood a line of cedar trees. Someone had carved names into their trunks. Dozens of names, some fresh, some nearly erased by time. He found Nathan Bell on the third tree. Below it, carved much more recently, was Elias Mercer. His stomach tightened. He stepped back, and a voice behind him said, You shouldn't touch them. An elderly man in a fisherman's coat stood on the path. Who carved these? Elias demanded. The river chooses. The valley records. That's nonsense. The old man shrugged. Most truths are, when first heard. He pointed to Nathan Bell's name. The teacher before you tried to cut his away. The next morning the river gave it back. You expect me to believe a river carves names into trees? No, the fisherman said. I expect you to remember that your own name is there. Hashtag part 4. The second name. Rain fell for the next 2 days. Elias taught reading, spelling, and arithmetic while trying to ignore the unease growing inside him. Every evening, he checked the riverbank. Every evening, his carved name remained. On the third night, he awoke to the sound of water dripping onto the floor. The ceiling above his bed was dry. The dripping came from the teacher's desk. He lit the lamp. A sheet of paper lay on the desktop, soaked as though pulled from the river. Across the page, written in dark ink, was his name, Elias Mercer. Again, his breath caught. The message beneath it read, October 29th, 3:17. Elias stumbled backward. The warning under the desk flashed through his mind. If you find your name twice, leave before the second sunrise. He snatched his coat and hurried outside. The village was asleep. Rain hissed through the trees. He reached Martha Hale's house and pounded on the door. She opened it immediately, fully dressed, as though she had been waiting. Elias thrust the wet paper toward her. Explain this. She looked at the name, then at him. For the first time since his arrival, fear crossed her face. You found the second notice. What does that mean? It means the valley has decided. Decided what? Martha stepped aside and motioned him in. You should sit down, Mr. Mercer. The story is longer than the night. Outside, the river continued moving through the darkness, carrying its secrets toward a future that already seemed to know his name. Elias did not sit. He remained near the door, rainwater dripping from his coat onto the wooden floor. Martha Hale closed the door behind him and set the lantern on the table. The room smelled of cedar smoke and dried herbs. You said the valley decided, he said. What exactly has it decided? Martha poured 2 cups of coffee from a blackened kettle. That you belong to the river now. I don't belong to any river. Neither did Nathan Bell when he arrived. Elias stared at her. You still haven't explained what happened to him. Martha folded her hands. Gray Hollow was founded in 1798 by a group of settlers who became trapped here during an early snowstorm. They discovered that the valley could not be crossed once winter closed the passes. At first they believed they were simply isolated. Then the names began appearing. On trees. At first on stones near the river. Later on wood, walls, and sometimes paper. Always before something happened. What kind of things? Martha looked toward the window. Deaths. Disappearances. Births. Arrivals. The valley writes them before they occur. Elias shook his head. That's impossible. The first settlers thought so too. One man, named Samuel Crow, burned every stone that carried a name. The next morning his own name appeared on the church door. He was found in the river 3 days later. You expect me to accept a ghost story? I expect you to decide whether you want to leave before sunrise. The room fell silent except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Elias pulled the wet paper from his pocket. This says October 29th, 3:17. What happens then? The same thing that happened to Nathan Bell, which is, he went to the river. Voluntarily? Martha did not answer. For a long moment, Elias considered walking out, packing his belongings, and climbing the mountain road before dawn. Yet a stubborn part of him refused to flee from superstition. He had spent years teaching children to think rationally. If he ran now, he would be surrendering to fear. I'm staying, he said. Martha closed her eyes briefly, as if she had hoped for a different answer. Then listened carefully. If you hear the church bell after midnight, do not go outside. If anyone calls your name from the riverbank, do not answer. And if you see your name written a 3rd time, what then? Pray that it is not in your own handwriting. Elias left before she could say anything else. The rain had stopped. Clouds drifted across a pale moon. As he walked back to the schoolhouse, he noticed lights glowing in several houses. Curtains shifted. Faces watched him pass. At the well, the plaque still hung above the dark water. October 29th, 1887. Elias Mercer. The river will remember. He forced himself to keep walking. Inside the schoolhouse, he locked the door, checked the windows, and placed a chair beneath the handle. Then he sat at the teacher's desk and examined the wet paper again. The ink was dark blue, almost black. The handwriting looked unfamiliar. Yet something about the final letter of his surname unsettled him. The curve of the R resembled his own. He told himself he was imagining it. Near dawn, he finally slept. When morning came, the children were already waiting outside. Their faces were unusually solemn. Clara Reed stepped forward. You stayed. Yes. Several of the younger children exchanged frightened glances. What is it? Elias asked. Clara handed him the attendance list. Beside Elias Mercer, someone had written the number 20. Who added this? He demanded. It was there when we arrived, Clara said. 20 days until what? Until the river remembers. The phrase made his skin crawl. Lessons proceeded poorly. The younger children kept staring toward the windows. Thomas Pike dropped his slate when a raven landed on the sill. Lucy Hale burst into tears during reading practice. At midday, Elias dismissed them early. Go home, he said. We'll continue tomorrow. As the children gathered their books, Edwin Cole lingered near the desk. Mr. Mercer, he whispered, did the paper come wet? Yes. The boy swallowed hard. Then you should find where it came from. What do you mean? Edwin glanced toward the river. The water only brings back what was put into it. Then he ran after the others. Elias spent the afternoon searching the schoolhouse. He checked the cabinet, the attic, even the crawl space beneath the floorboards. Near the back wall, he discovered a loose plank. Beneath it lay a small leather notebook. The cover bore the initials NB, Nathan Bell's journal. Most pages were filled with ordinary observations about lessons and village life. Then, halfway through, the writing changed. April 12th. They know things before they happen. A girl told me my lantern would break tomorrow. It did. April 19th. Found my name on the cedar trees. Martha says not to worry. April 27th. Woke to find my name written on wet paper. Same date. Same hour. May 1st. I tried to leave. The mountain road brought me back to the church. May 3rd. Heard someone calling from the river. It sounded like my father. May 5th. I have begun writing my name without realizing it. It appears in the margins of my books. May 6th. If another teacher finds this, do not trust the hour 3:17. That is when the river opens. The final page was torn out. Elias closed the notebook with trembling hands. Outside, the church bell rang once. It was only 3 in the afternoon. He stepped onto the porch. Villagers were emerging from their houses, looking toward the church. The black steeple stood against a darkening sky. Then the bell rang again. A third time. Martha, Hale hurried up the path. You need to come with me. What's happening? The river is rising. They walked quickly through the village. People carried lanterns and buckets despite the clear weather. At the riverbank, Elias stopped short. The water had climbed nearly 2 feet since morning. More disturbing were the objects floating on its surface. Papers. Dozens of them. Bed sheets drifting slowly downstream. One caught against a rock near the shore. Elias waded forward before Martha could stop him. He grabbed the paper and unfolded it. His name covered the page from top to bottom. Elias Mercer. Elias Mercer. Elias Mercer. Written over and over in the same dark ink. And this time he recognized the handwriting. It was his own. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. No, he whispered. I didn't write this. Martha took the paper gently. That's the third name. How could it be my handwriting? Because the river learns it. This is madness. Maybe, she said softly, but madness has drowned better men than you. Another sheet drifted against the shore. Then another, all of them covered in his name. The villagers backed away from the water. Some crossed themselves. Others bowed their heads. Elias looked upstream. Far beyond the bend, where the river disappeared into the cedar forest, a figure stood on the opposite bank. A man in a dark coat, holding a lantern. Even at that distance, Elias recognized the silver chain hanging from the man's vest. The pocket watch Martha had shown him. Nathan Bell raised the lantern and beckoned. Elias did not remember stepping backward, only the sensation of cold river water around his boots and Martha's hand gripping his arm. Don't look at him too long, she said. That's impossible, Elias whispered. Nathan Bell is dead. We never found a body. The figure across the river remained motionless, lantern glowing amber in the gathering dusk. For a moment, Elias thought he could see the man's face beneath the brim of his hat, but the distance was too great. Then the lantern slowly lowered, and the figure disappeared among the cedars. The villagers began retreating from the riverbank without speaking. No one seemed surprised. You've seen him before? Elias asked. Martha nodded once. Whenever the river rises before the date. And you never told me? Would you have believed me? Elias had no answer. Back at the schoolhouse, he spread the wet pages across the desk. Every sheet carried his name in the same hurried script. Some lines overlapped as though written by a shaking hand. He compared them to his own handwriting from the attendance book. The resemblance was exact. His head throbbed. He could not remember writing any of these pages. Yet he also could not deny what he saw. As darkness settled over Gray Hollow, a knock sounded at the door. Clara Reed entered carrying a covered basket. Mother sent supper, she said. Her eyes fell on the papers. You found them. Yes. Clara set the basket down carefully. Mr. Mercer, may I ask something? Go ahead. When you dream, do you see the river? Elias hesitated. The previous night, he had dreamed of standing knee-deep in black water, while someone whispered his name from beneath the surface. "Why do you ask?" Clara looked toward the window. "Everyone whose name appears dreams of it eventually. What happens then?" "Most people stop sleeping." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "My father's name appeared when I was 6, she said quietly. "He disappeared before winter." After she left, Elias sat alone with the basket untouched. Rain began again shortly after midnight. He tried to read Nathan Bell's journal, but the words blurred together. At some point, exhaustion dragged him into sleep. He was standing on the riverbank. Moonlight silvered the water. The cedar trees swayed without wind. "Elias." The voice came from the opposite shore. Nathan Bell stood there holding the lantern. "You need to cross," the former teacher called. "Why?" "Because it's already happened." "What has?" Nathan raised the lantern higher. "Look behind you." Elias turned. His own body lay on the riverbank. Eyes closed, hands folded across his chest. Water dripping from his hair. He woke with a shout. The lamp had gone out. The room was dark except for moonlight, and someone was sitting at the teacher's desk. Elias froze. The figure wore a dark coat and hat. A silver watch chain glinted across the vest. "Nathan." The man did not answer. Slowly, he slid a sheet of paper across the desk. Then he stood and walked toward the stairs. Elias found his voice. "Wait." The figure paused halfway down. "How do I stop this?" A long silence followed. Finally, the man spoke without turning around. "I asked the same question." His voice sounded tired, older than Elias expected. "And?" The valley answered with another name. Then he descended the stairs. Elias rushed after him, lantern in hand. The front door stood open. Outside, rain fell through empty darkness. No footprints marked the mud, only the sound of the river. He returned to the desk and unfolded the paper. It was a map, not of the valley, but of the river itself. A narrow tributary branched north into the mountains, ending at a circle marked with a single word. Source. Beneath it, in Nathan Bell's handwriting, were the words. "The names begin here." Elias did not sleep again. Before dawn, he packed a lantern, rope, matches, and a notebook. If the river had a source, he intended to find it. When he stepped outside, Martha Hale was waiting on the porch. "I wonder how long it would take," she said. Elias held up the map. "You know about this place. Everyone in Gray Hollow knows about it. Then why has no one gone there?" Martha's face tightened. "Because no one who goes returns the same." Nathan went. "Yes," and came back last night. For the first time, genuine shock crossed her features. "You saw him inside the schoolhouse. He gave me this." Martha looked at the map as though it were a snake. "Then he wants you to reach the source before the date." "What is it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "My grandfather claimed there was a spring hidden in the mountains. He said the first settlers found names floating in its water before they ever built the village." "Why keep living here?" Martha's voice became very quiet. "Because the valley also warns us. Every fire, every flood, every sickness. The names appear before the danger comes. Gray Hollow survives because the river remembers what is about to happen." "At what cost?" She did not answer. Elias started toward the northern trail. "Mr. Mercer," Martha called after him. He turned. "If you reach the source," she said, "don't let it learn your voice." The path climbed steeply through cedar forest. Mist clung to the branches. By noon, Elias had followed the tributary deep into the mountains. The stream grew narrower and colder, flowing over pale stones. Several times he found names carved into trees. Samuel Crow, Clara Reed, Nathan Bell, and always farther along, Elias Mercer. Near evening, the forest opened onto a rocky basin. At its center lay a pool of perfectly still water. No stream fed it. No stream flowed out. Yet the tributary ended here, vanishing beneath the stones at the pool's edge. Elias approached slowly. The surface reflected the darkening sky like polished glass. Then ripples spread across the water, though nothing had touched it. A sheet of paper rose from the center of the pool. Vet, white, floating toward him. Elias bent and picked it up. The page was blank except for one line written in fresh ink. "Who are you when no one has spoken your name?" The letters began to move. Ink spread across the paper, forming new words before his eyes. Elias Mercer, October 29th, 1887, 3:17. And beneath them, a final sentence appeared. Return what was taken. The pool suddenly reflected not the sky, but a classroom. A man sat at the teacher's desk, writing furiously. Nathan Bell. He looked up from the reflection and met Elias's eyes. "It has your name now," he said from within the water. "The only way to leave is to give it another." "Another what?" Elias demanded. Nathan's expression twisted with anguish. "Another future." The surface of the pool shattered into ripples, and a second face appeared beside Nathan's. Elias's own, smiling. The smiling face vanished before Elias could react. The pool returned to stillness, reflecting only the dark basin and the first stars above the mountains. He staggered back from the water, clutching the wet page. "Another future," he repeated aloud. The words made no sense, yet Nathan Bell's expression had carried a desperation that could not be mistaken. Elias looked around the basin. Moss-covered rocks ringed the pool. Cedars leaned inward as though guarding it. Near the far edge of the basin, he noticed a structure half hidden by vines. A cabin. It looked ancient, its roof sagging under decades of weather. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Elias approached cautiously and pushed it open. Inside, dust lay thick across a single room. A narrow bed, a stone hearth, and a rough table were the only furnishings. On the table sat a wooden box. He lifted the lid. Dozens of folded papers filled the box. Each carried a name and a date. Samuel Crow, January 14th, 1802. Abigail Pike, March 3rd, 1819. Jonah Reed, November 8th, 1847. Nathan Bell, May 7th, 1887. Elias unfolded Nathan's paper. "The river will remember. Return what was taken." At the bottom, in different handwriting, someone had written. He refused. A chill crept through Elias. He searched the box until he found another paper marked with a date from 1802. "The river will remember. Return what was taken." And beneath it, she refused. Another. He refused. Another. They refused. Every paper ended the same way. Elias set them down slowly. Whoever had lived in this cabin had been keeping a record for nearly a century. Then he noticed the ledger beneath the box. Its leather cover had cracked with age. When he opened it, the first page read, "To the one who arrives after me. If you are reading this, the river has already written your name. I was the keeper before Nathan Bell, and another kept the names before me. The valley believes the river warns us out of mercy. They are wrong. It warns us because it cannot see by itself. The names are not predictions. They are collections. Each person whose name appears leaves something behind at the source. A memory, a possibility, a future that will never be lived. That is how the valley survives. And that is why no one truly leaves." The entry was signed Eleanor Pike, 1863. Elias turned pages feverishly. When Samuel Crow's name appeared, he was meant to become a surveyor in Pittsburgh. After the river took him, no one in the valley could remember what a surveyor was. When Abigail Pike's name appeared, she was engaged to a man in Philadelphia. After the river took her, the letters from Philadelphia arrived blank. When Jonah Reed disappeared, his daughter could no longer remember the color of his eyes. The source does not merely take people. It takes the futures attached to them. Elias felt suddenly nauseous. He thought of his school in Columbus, the students who had expected him back in spring, the boarding house where his books still sat on a shelf. What would happen if the river remembered him? Would those places simply forget he had existed? He turned to the final pages. Nathan Bell reached the source today. I told him what I now tell you. There is one way to leave Gray Hollow intact. The river must receive a future willingly surrendered. Not a life, a future. Most cannot bear the choice. The last line was written in shaky ink. If Nathan refuses, the river will begin collecting names on its own. Outside, wind rushed through the cedars. Elias closed the ledger and stared toward the pool. "What future?" he whispered. As if answering, the water rippled again. This time it showed a different scene. A brick schoolhouse in Columbus. Elias stood at the front of the classroom, older than he was now. Gray touched his hair. Children laughed as he wrote on a blackboard. The image shifted. A small house with a white fence. A woman whose face he could not clearly see opened the door, smiling as he approached. Another shift. A boy of perhaps 10 sat beside him at a table, struggling through a reading lesson while Elias patiently corrected the words. The visions struck him like physical blows. They were not memories. They were possibilities. The life he might have lived. The pool darkened. New words spread across its surface. Choose. Elias backed away. No. The water remained still. You want me to give up my future? The pool did not answer. Yet somewhere in the mountains, a church bell rang. One slow note, then another. Elias looked up sharply. The sound could not possibly have come from Gray Hollow. The village lay miles away. A third note echoed through the basin. 3:17. He checked his pocket watch. The hands pointed to 3:17 exactly. The air around the pool grew colder. Mist rose from the water and drifted across the stones. Within the mist, shapes began to form. People. A woman in a 19th century dress. A bearded man with a surveyor's compass. A child clutching a wooden toy. Dozens of pale figures standing silently around the basin. Elias recognized some of the names from the box. Samuel Crow, Abigail Pike, Jonah Reed, and among them, Nathan Bell. Unlike the others, Nathan stepped forward. I refused, he said. I thought I could escape. You're dead, Elias whispered. No, worse. Nathan raised his hand. The mist around him trembled. The river took my future anyway. It just took it piece by piece. What does that mean? I can remember my childhood. I can remember becoming a teacher. I cannot remember what I wanted after that. His face tightened. Every year, I forget another possibility. Elias looked at the other figures. Their expressions were distant, unfocused, as though parts of them had already faded. You're trapped here, he said. Nathan nodded. And if I refuse? The river will start collecting from a valley. Children first. They have the largest futures. Elias's stomach dropped. He remembered the numbers beside the students' names. Edwin Cole, 3. Thomas Pike, 12. Clara Reed, 37. Days. Not until death. Until collection. Why did Martha tell me? Because every keeper hopes the next one will choose differently. The mist stirred. One by one the pale figures turned toward Elias. Not threatening. Waiting. Nathan's voice softened. You came here to teach children. This is the lesson the valley could never learn. And if I surrender my future, you will leave Gray Hollow. Alive. Yes. With my memories? Nathan hesitated. Most of them. Most. The river keeps what you give it. Elias looked into the pool again. For a moment, he saw the classroom in Columbus, the house, the unseen woman, the child at the table. A life that had never happened and now might never happen. Then the vision shifted. Edwin Cole, standing alone beside the river. Clara Reed staring at a blank page where her father's letters should have been. Lucy Hale, crying during reading practice. The children of Gray Hollow, one future at a time, disappearing into forgetfulness. The bell rang again. 3:17. The pool began to glow from within. Words surfaced across the water. Return what was taken. Nathan stepped back into the mist. The choice must be willing, he said. That is the only rule it cannot break. The pale figures slowly faded, leaving Elias alone with the glowing pool. His watch still read 3:17. The hands had stopped moving. Wind rushed through the cedars. Somewhere far below, hidden in darkness, the river carried the valley's names toward whatever waited downstream. Elias Mercer stood at the edge of the source and realized that for the first time since arriving in Gray Hollow, the future truly belonged to him. Only now he had to decide whether to keep it. Elias stood motionless beside the glowing pool while the stopped hands of his watch pointed endlessly to 3:17. The visions had faded, but their weight remained inside him. He could still feel the warmth of the imagined house in Columbus, the laughter of children who had never existed, the smile of a woman whose face he would now never fully know. For several minutes he tried to speak and found that he could not. Finally he whispered, "If I do this, what exactly is taken?" The pool answered not with a voice but with another image. He saw himself years from now, standing in a crowded railway station. He was older, carrying a suitcase, looking around as though searching for someone. The image dissolved before he found them. Another vision appeared. He was sitting at a desk, writing a book. The title page was blank. The ink dried before he could write his name. Then a final vision. Elias walking through a city street, pausing as a child ran past him. He smiled politely, but there was no recognition in his eyes, no memory of having ever wanted a family. The pool darkened. Understanding settled over him with terrible clarity. The river would not erase his past. It would erase his attachment to the future he surrendered. The possibilities would become inaccessible, like rooms in a house whose doors have been sealed shut. He looked down at the wet paper in his hand. Return what was taken. Below it, new words slowly formed. Place your name in the water. Elias hesitated. Then, with trembling fingers, he took a pencil from his satchel and wrote, Elias Mercer. The letters looked ordinary, human, fragile. He folded the paper once and laid it upon the surface of the pool. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the water accepted it. The page sank without a ripple. A sound like a distant sigh moved through the cedars. The glow beneath the pool brightened, then spread outward in pale rings of light. Elias felt a sharp pressure behind his eyes. Memories surged through him, not disappearing but loosening, as though their roots had been cut. The imagined house became hazy. The unseen woman's smile faded first. The boy at the reading table vanished next. Elias tried to hold on to the image and found that he could not. It slipped away like water through open fingers. Pain lanced through his chest, sudden and overwhelming. He doubled over, gasping. Voices echoed around the basin. When he looked up, the mist figures had returned. But now they were changing. Samuel Crow's outline sharpened. Abigail Pike's face became clearer. Nathan Bell's shoulders straightened as though a great weight had been lifted. Nathan stepped forward. "It's done," he said. "I can't remember." Elias pressed a hand to his forehead. "There was someone." "Yes," Nathan said gently. "There was." Elias felt tears on his cheeks and did not know why they were falling. The stopped watch in his pocket suddenly ticked. 3:18. The first movement of time he had seen since reaching the source. The pool's surface became transparent. At its bottom lay hundreds of papers, layered upon one another like fallen leaves. Names, dates, futures surrendered across generations. His own paper settled among them. As it touched the others, a current of light swept through the basin. The mist figures began to fade. "Wait," Elias called to Nathan. "What happens to you now?" Nathan looked toward the trees. For the first time, he smiled. "I think I get to leave." His form dissolved into drifting silver mist. One by one, the others vanished as well, until only Elias remained beside the quiet pool. The church bell rang again in the distance, but now it sounded ordinary. He checked his watch. The hands moved normally. Night had deepened. Stars filled the narrow strip of sky above the basin. Elias gathered the ledger, the box of names, and his satchel. Before leaving, he looked once more into the pool. The water reflected only his face. No Ismail, no ghostly double, just a tired schoolteacher standing alone in the mountains. The walk back to Gray Hollow took until dawn. As he descended through the cedars, he noticed something strange. The carved names on the trees were disappearing. Samuel Crow had faded to a faint scar in the bark. Abigail Pike was nearly gone. When he reached the tree that had borne Elias Mercer, the wood was smooth and unmarked. A cold breeze stirred the branches. For the first time since arriving in the valley, Elias felt no urge to look over his shoulder. Gray Hollow emerged from the morning mist as church bells rang for breakfast. Villagers stood outside their houses watching him approach. Martha Hale hurried across the square. "You came back," she breathed. "Yes." Her eyes searched his face. "The river." Elias opened the box of papers. The names inside were fading even as she looked. Martha covered her mouth. "You chose," she whispered. He nodded. Then the children. They'll keep their futures. Martha closed her eyes in relief. News spread quickly. By midday, the villagers had gathered near the well. One after another, they examined the plaque that had hung there for generations. The date remained, but the name beneath it had vanished. Only the words "the river will remember" were left. Classes resumed the next morning. Edwin Cole entered carrying his slate and looked puzzled. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "the number beside my name is gone." Elias checked the attendance list. The column of numbers had disappeared entirely. Clara Reed smiled for the first time since he had met her. "I think my father would have liked you," she said. Elias opened his mouth to answer, then paused. For a brief instant, he could not remember why her father mattered. The thought slipped away before he could grasp it. He felt a flicker of unease. Something had indeed been taken. Days passed. The river returned to its normal level. No wet papers appeared on the desk. The church bell rang only at proper hours. Gray Hollow slowly resumed the rhythm of ordinary life. Yet Elias noticed small absences. He would begin writing a letter to a friend in Columbus and stop, unable to remember what he had wanted to say. He would look at couples walking through the village and feel a strange emptiness, as though he had forgotten a language he once intended to learn. One evening, Martha found him sitting outside the schoolhouse watching the river. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Elias considered the question. "Yes," he said, "but not in the way I expected." Martha sat beside him. "My grandfather used to say that grief is the shape left behind when a future changes." Elias looked at the water. "Do you think I made the right choice?" "The children still have theirs," she replied. That was answer enough. Winter came early to Gray Hollow. Snow covered the fields and turned the riverbanks white. Elias remained through December, then January, then February. No new names appeared. In March, the mountain road opened again. A stagecoach arrived for the first time in months. Boone, the same silent driver who had brought him, climbed down from the seat. "Road's clear," he said. Elias looked toward the schoolhouse behind him. Children's voices drifted from the open windows. For a moment, he tried to picture the life waiting in Columbus. Nothing came. Not emptiness exactly. More like a book whose final chapters had been removed. Boone studied him. "You leaving?" Elias looked at the river one last time. The water moved quietly between the stones, carrying sunlight instead of names. "No," he said at last. "I think I'm already where I'm supposed to be." The driver nodded as though he had expected that answer all along. As the coach disappeared back into the mountains, Elias returned to the schoolhouse. Clara was waiting at the door. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "we're starting the history lesson." He smiled and stepped inside. The classroom smelled of chalk, pine smoke, and melting snow. 12 students opened their books as he took his place at the desk. Outside, the river flowed past Gray Hollow without speaking. And for the first time in more than a century, the valley kept tomorrow's names to itself. Spring returned to Gray Hollow with slow patience. Snow withdrew from the fields in uneven patches, and the river carried broken pieces of ice downstream like fragments of a season that had finally surrendered. Elias Mercer settled into a life he had never planned. He taught arithmetic in the mornings, reading in the afternoons, and history whenever the weather kept the children indoors. The villagers no longer watched him with the guarded curiosity of a newcomer. They nodded when he passed, invited him to supper, and asked his opinion about planting schedules and repairs to the church roof. Yet the valley had changed in ways that were harder to name. The cedar trees along the riverbank bore no carved names. The plaque above the well remained blank, except for the weathered phrase "the river will remember." Children who once avoided future tense now used it freely. "I will visit my cousin in summer," Lucy Hale announced during a grammar lesson. "I will become a blacksmith," Thomas Pike declared. Edwin Cole thought for a moment before adding, "I will leave the valley one day and see the ocean." No one flinched to the words. Elias corrected their spelling and tried not to think about how impossible such a conversation would have seemed months earlier. Some evenings he walked to the river alone. The water looked ordinary now, but he could never entirely forget the glowing pool hidden in the mountains. He carried the memory of it the way a sailor carries the memory of a storm long after reaching shore. Or perhaps not the memory itself, more the outline of one. There were still gaps inside him. He would wake from dreams already fading, with the sense that someone had spoken his name affectionately. He could never remember the face attached to the voice. Once he found himself standing outside Martha Hale's house at dusk, uncertain why he had come. Another time, he bought a small wooden toy from the carpenter and only later realized he had no child to give it to. He kept the toy in his desk drawer. In June, a stranger arrived. The stagecoach appeared just after noon, rattling across the bridge while villagers paused in their work to stare. Visitors were rare enough that everyone noticed. The passenger was a woman in a dark traveling coat, carrying a leather valise and a rolled map case. She stepped down with the confidence of someone accustomed to long journeys. "Good afternoon," she said. "I'm looking for Mr. Elias Mercer." A dozen eyes turned toward the schoolhouse. Elias emerged from the doorway, chalk dust still on his sleeves. The woman studied him for a long moment. "So you're alive," she said. "I beg your pardon? My name is Charlotte Avery. I teach at the Ohio State Normal School. You disappeared 6 months ago." The words struck him oddly. Disappeared, as though she were speaking about another man. Martha Hale approached from the square, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps we should talk inside," she suggested. In the schoolhouse, Charlotte Avery removed a stack of letters from her valise and placed them on the desk. "These were sent to you in Columbus," she said. "When you never returned, the school board assumed you had met with an accident in the mountains. I was asked to determine what happened." Elias stared at the familiar handwriting on the envelopes. Some were from fellow teachers. One bore the seal of the state education office. Another, written in a careful script he did not recognize, had no return address. A strange ache moved through him. "I've been here the entire time," he said. Charlotte looked around the classroom. "Then why did no one receive a single letter from you?" Elias opened his mouth, then closed it. He remembered beginning several letters. He did not remember finishing them. Martha quietly left the room. Charlotte leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, I traveled through 3 counties looking for this valley. Half the maps omitted it entirely. The coach driver who finally agreed to bring me here demanded double fare and warned me not to stay after dark." She lowered her voice. "What is this place?" Elias looked toward the window where children's laughter drifted across the yard. "A town," he said carefully. "One that was lost for a very long time." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." Charlotte studied him with the sharp attention of a teacher evaluating a difficult student. "You've changed," she said. "People usually do after 6 months." "No, I knew you in Columbus. You used to speak about the future constantly." Elias felt a flicker of unease. "Did I? You wanted to write textbooks. You wanted to open a school of your own." The words sounded distant, almost implausible. "I don't remember saying that." Charlotte's expression softened. "That's what worries me." She stayed the night at Martha Hale's house. After supper, Martha found Elias sitting beside the river. "She knows something is wrong," he said. "Wouldn't you?" Martha replied. Elias skipped a stone across the water. "I barely remember Columbus. I know facts about it, but the feeling is gone. The river kept what you gave it." "I know." Martha was silent for a moment. "Do you regret it?" Elias watched the ripples fade. "I regret not being able to remember why I once wanted something else." That night, he opened the unfamiliar letter from the stack Charlotte had brought. Inside was a single sheet. "Dear Elias, if you're reading this, then you've finally accepted the position in Pennsylvania. I hope the mountain air suits you better than Columbus did. When you return, perhaps we can continue the conversation we never quite finished. Yours, Margaret." Nothing more. No surname. No explanation. Elias read it 3 times. He could not remember who Margaret was. Yet the name filled him with a grief so sudden that he had to sit down. The next morning, Charlotte accompanied him to the riverbank. "I'm leaving this afternoon," she said. "You found me. Isn't that what you came for?" "Yes." She hesitated. "But I don't think you're coming back." Elias looked at the water. "No," he admitted. Charlotte studied the blank plaque above the well. "There's a story here, isn't there?" "Several. Will you tell me?" Elias considered the question. Then he shook his head. "If I told you, you'd spend the rest of your life trying to prove it was impossible. And is it He thought of glowing water, fading names, and futures surrendered into a mountain spring. I honestly don't know anymore. Charlotte smiled faintly. That sounds more like the old Elias than anything you've said since I arrived. Before boarding the stagecoach, she handed him a small package. Inside was a fountain pen. For the book you never wrote, she said. The coach rolled away, carrying the last direct connection to his former life. Elias stood in the road until it vanished into the trees. Summer deepened. One evening, while organizing supplies in the attic above the classroom, Elias discovered a loose board beneath the floor. Hidden there was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay the missing final page of Nathan Bell's journal. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. May 7th, 1887. I reached the source. Eleanor Pike told me the truth. I could not surrender my future. I thought love would be enough to resist the river. I was wrong. If another teacher finds this, know that I tried to return. Every year the river takes another possibility from me. Soon I will forget why I fought it at all. There is one mercy. The one who finally chooses will free the rest of us. If that happens, tell the valley I'm sorry. Elias folded the page carefully. For the first time, he understood that Nathan Bell had not failed through cowardice. He had failed because he had something he could not bear to lose. Elias tried to imagine what that had been. A face? A promise? A future? The answer remained just beyond reach. In August, Edwin Cole approached him after class. Mr. Mercer, the boy said, do you think people can choose who they become? Elias looked up from grading papers. Why do you ask? My father says the valley used to decide everything. But now everyone keeps talking about choices. Elias set down his pen. Outside, the river glimmered in late afternoon sunlight. I think, he said slowly, that we're shaped by many things. Where we're born, what happens to us, who we meet. But eventually there comes a moment when no one else can choose for us. Edwin considered this. Did that happen to you? Elias felt the old ache stir again. Yes, he said. And did you choose right? He looked at the classroom, filled with children planning futures they were finally free to imagine. I think so. Edwin nodded, satisfied, and ran outside. That autumn, the villagers gathered for the harvest festival beside the church. Lanterns hung from the trees, and fiddlers played, while children chased one another through the square. Martha Hale found Elias standing near the well. You're watching everyone as if you've never seen a festival before, she said. Maybe I haven't seen one quite like this. She followed his gaze. Clara Reed was laughing with friends. Thomas Pike was helping the blacksmith serve cider. Edwin Cole was describing the ocean to anyone who would listen despite having never seen it. Do you know what's strange? Elias said. What? A year ago, this valley was afraid of tomorrow. Now the children argue about what they'll do 10 years from now. Martha smiled. That was always the real curse, she said. Not the river. The fear that the future belonged to someone else. Elias looked at the blank plaque above the well. For a moment, under the lantern light, he thought he saw faint letters forming in the wood. His breath caught. But when he looked closer, there was nothing there except weathered grain. The river flowed quietly beyond the square. And though a part of him would always wonder what future lay sleeping at the bottom of the mountain pool, Elias Mercer no longer felt owned by the question. Some futures were surrendered, some were forgotten, and some, unexpectedly, began in the very place where another life had ended. By the second winter, Elias no longer thought of himself as a visitor. He knew which houses would lose heat first when the north wind arrived. He knew that Martha Hale added cinnamon to her cider when she was worried, and that the church bell froze if snow packed into the tower's western side. He knew that Thomas Pike pretended to dislike reading, but secretly borrowed adventure novels from the schoolhouse shelf. Gray Hollow had become familiar enough that its silences carried meaning, which was why he noticed when the valley fell too quiet. It happened in January during a storm that buried the roads and sealed the mountain passes. Snow pressed against the windows of the schoolhouse while the children copied spelling words beside the stove. Then Edwin Cole stopped writing. Mr. Mercer, he said softly, do you hear that? Elias listened. Nothing. No wind. No creaking branches. No river. The river had stopped. Every child in the room looked toward the windows. Clara Reed was the first to stand. "It's never silent," she whispered. Elias moved to the door despite the sudden tightness in his chest. Outside, snow fell in slow white sheets. Beyond the church, the river lay perfectly still. Not frozen. Still. The water looked like black glass. And on its surface, a single sheet of paper drifted toward the shore. Elias reached the riverbank before anyone could stop him. The paper touched the snow at his feet. He stared at it for several seconds before bending down. The page was dry. Written across it in dark ink was one line. "The debt is not finished." Below the words appeared a date. January 28th, 1889. 3 days away. Martha Hale arrived breathless behind him. When she saw the paper, all color left her face. "No," she whispered. "What does this mean?" Elias asked. "I don't know. You've seen something like this before." Martha's hands trembled. "Only once. When the first keeper died." Elias looked back at the motionless river. "You said the curse was broken." "I thought it was." That night the village gathered in the church. Snow hissed against the stained glass windows while lantern light flickered across anxious faces. Elias placed the paper on the altar. "Tell me everything," he said. An elderly fisherman named Jacob Turner spoke first. "My grandfather told me about the first keeper," he said. "A woman named Ruth Crow. When the names began appearing, she went into the mountains and made a bargain with the source." "What kind of bargain?" "No one knew. Only that the river stopped taking people for a while." Martha closed her eyes until it asked for another keeper. "And another after that," Jacob said. Each one passed the burden forward. Elias felt cold despite the crowded church. "You're saying my choice ended the collections, but not the bargain itself." No one answered. Clara Reed, now nearly 17, spoke from the back pew. "If the debt isn't finished, what happens on January 28th? Silence settled over the church. Then, from outside, the bell rang once. Not from the tower, from the river. Elias did not sleep. He spread the old ledger across his desk and searched every page for references to a debt. Near dawn, he found a passage written in a different hand from Eleanor Pike's. "The source does not give warnings freely. Every future surrendered feeds the valley for one generation. When the generation ends, the river asks whether the bargain will continue. If no keeper answers, the water returns to silence." The entry was unsigned. One generation. Elias counted backward. Ruth Crow had vanished in 1802. Another keeper in the 1830s. Another in the 1860s. Nathan Bell had reached the source in 1887, and Elias had completed the bargain, which meant January 28th, 1889 was not an end. It was a question. The storm cleared on the morning of the 28th. Sunlight glittered across fresh snow as the entire village walked to the riverbank. The water remained unnaturally still. At exactly noon, a crack appeared in the center of the river. Not ice, water. The surface split open like a seam. A narrow current flowed upstream toward the mountains. Every villager stepped back except Elias. The current carried another paper. It stopped at his feet. "Keeper? Nothing else." Elias looked at Martha. "What happens if I say no?" Her voice was barely audible. "I don't know. And if I say yes?" "The bargain continues." Claire stepped forward. "What does that mean for you?" Elias understood before anyone answered. Another future. Another piece of himself given to the river. The valley watched him in silence. For the first time since arriving in Gray Hollow, he felt anger rise inside him. Not at the river, at the bargain itself, at generations forced to choose between their own futures and everyone else's. He looked down at the paper. Keeper? Then he remembered Edwin's question months earlier. Do people choose who they become? Elias took a deep breath. No, he said aloud. The river darkened. Martha gasped. The current reversed direction, rushing back toward the mountains. The crack in the water widened. For one terrifying moment, Elias thought the entire river would burst its banks. Then the current stopped. A new sheet of paper rose from the opening. Not carried by water. Lifted by it. Elias picked it up. The page was blank, except for a single line written in fresh ink. Then choose another answer. The river began moving again. Normally, the crack vanished as though it had never existed. Villagers stared at Elias. He stared at the paper. What does that mean? Clara asked. Elias looked upstream, toward the hidden mountains. I think, he said slowly, the source is tired of keepers too. That evening he made a decision. He packed the ledger, Nathan Bell's final page, and a blank paper from the river. Then he walked to Martha Hale's house. I'm going back to the source, he told her. Martha's expression tightened. Alone? Yes. Elias, whatever happened today, we don't understand it. Exactly. He held up the paper. For a century, the valley assumed there were only two choices: continue the bargain or let the river collect futures. But this says another answer exists. And if you're wrong? Elias looked toward the schoolhouse where lamplight glowed in the windows. Then at least I'll be the first keeper who asked a different question. He left before dawn. The trail through the cedars felt familiar now. Snow muffled his footsteps as he climbed toward the basin. By midday, he reached the pool. The water was waiting. Still, dark, reflective. Elias placed the blank paper on the stone beside it. I won't give you another future, he said. The pool remained silent. And I won't let you take theirs. Ripples spread across the surface. Words appeared. Then who will remember? Elias frowned. What? The words dissolved and reformed. The valley survives because futures are remembered. Without memory, tomorrow becomes blind. Elias thought suddenly of the warnings the river had once provided. Fires, floods, sickness, disasters avoided because someone knew they were coming. You're not feeding on futures, he said slowly. You're storing them. The pool brightened. I remember what might be. And the keepers? They taught me how. Elias stared at the water. For a century, the valley had misunderstood the source. It had not been demanding sacrifice out of hunger. It had been preserving possibilities because no one had ever shown it another way. A thought struck him. What if you didn't need one keeper? He asked. What if the whole valley remembered together? The pool went still. Then, slowly, a final question appeared. Will they choose it willingly? Elias looked down at the blank paper in his hand. For the first time, he knew what the river had been asking all along. Not for sacrifice, for a choice. Elias remained beside the pool until the light faded from the basin. The question on the water did not disappear. Will they choose it willingly? For more than a century, one person at a time had answered for the entire valley. Ruth Crowe, Eleanor Pike, Nathan Bell, Elias himself. Each had stood alone at the source and made a choice that bound everyone else. Now, the river was asking something different. Elias understood the difference with unsettling clarity. A keeper surrendered a future. A community surrendered certainty. He folded the blank paper and began the long walk back through the cedars. The village gathered in the church before he had even reached the square. Word of his return spread quickly. Snow clung to his coat as he stepped inside. Martha Hale rose from the front pew. What did the source say? Elias looked at the faces around him. Farmers, blacksmiths, children, widows, families who had lived their entire lives believing that tomorrow belonged to the river. It asked whether you would choose willingly. A murmur moved through the church. Choose what? Jacob Turner demanded. Elias set the blank paper on the altar. 4 generations. One keeper gave up a future so the river could remember possibilities for the valley. But the source says it doesn't need a keeper. It needs memory. Confused silence answered him. He took a breath. Think about what the river actually did. It warned you of fires, floods, sickness. It preserved what might happen so the valley could prepare. One person carried that burden alone, and the cost was a future. Clara Reed stepped forward. What's the other choice? That all of us remember together. Ow! Martha asked. I don't know yet. That was the honest answer. The answer came from an unexpected place. The next morning, Edwin Cole arrived at the schoolhouse, carrying a stack of notebooks. My mother found these in the attic, he said. They belonged to my grandfather. Elias opened one. It contained daily observations, weather, river levels, illnesses, crop yields, unusual animal behavior, dreams that later proved meaningful. He wrote everything down, Edwin said. Mother says most families used to do it. Elias looked up sharply. Most families? Before the keepers, yes. A realization struck him. The source had learned to remember because people had once remembered for themselves. The keepers had not created the bargain. They had replaced a lost habit. For the next week, Elias visited every house in Gray Hollow. He asked the villagers to bring old journals, letters, weather records, and family notebooks to the schoolhouse. By Saturday, the classroom was filled with them. Clara organized dates. Thomas sorted flood records. Lucy copied reports of sickness outbreaks. Even Jacob Turner contributed decades of fishing notes. Martha stood among the stacks in amazement. I had no idea we still had all this. Neither did I, Elias admitted. He looked around the room. For the first time, the valley's memory existed in human hands instead of a mountain spring. On the evening of February 3rd, Elias carried a single notebook to the riverbank. Martha walked beside him. Are you sure about this? She asked. No, he said, but I'm sure the old way can't continue. The entire village gathered near the water. Snow reflected the lantern light, turning the riverbank silver and gold. Elias opened the notebook. This belonged to Edwin's grandfather, he said. It records 20 years of storms, droughts, and harvests. He remembered for the valley. He looked at the river. If the source truly remembers possibilities, then let it remember that we are willing to do the same. He placed the notebook on the water. Instead of sinking, it floated. The river carried it a few feet downstream and stopped. The surface rippled. Words formed in pale light. One remembers. Clara stepped forward with a second notebook. My father's letters, she said. The ones I still have. She set them on the water. The river accepted them beside the first. To remember. Thomas Pike added his family's flood records. Lucy Hale placed a journal of illnesses and recoveries. Jacob Turner contributed fishing logs dating back 40 years. One by one, villagers stepped forward. Each offering floated on the water instead of sinking. Each edition brought new words. 7 remember. 15 remember. 23 remember. At last Martha Hale approached carrying a worn leather ledger. Elias recognized it immediately. The school trustee records, kept continuously since the valley was founded. She placed it gently among the others. The river brightened. The valley remembers. A warm wind moved across the snow. The lantern flames bent, but did not go out. Then the notebooks slowly sank beneath the surface, not dragged down, but lowered, as though accepted into careful hands. The river glowed from bank to bank. For a moment, every person standing there saw something different. Clara later said she saw her father smiling from a distant porch. Thomas saw a forge larger than any in Gray Hollow. Lucy saw herself teaching younger children to read. Edwin saw an ocean stretching beyond the horizon. Elias saw a classroom filled with sunlight. And standing beside the desk was a woman whose face he still could not fully remember. This time, the vision did not hurt. It simply nodded and faded. The river's light slowly dimmed. When darkness returned, the water moved normally again. No words remained on its surface. Martha broke the silence first. Is it over? Elias listened. The river flowed. The church bell rang the hour. No hidden voices called from the water. No paper drifted from the current. I think, he said, it's finally become what it was always meant to be. Spring arrived early that year. The mountain road opened in March, and for the first time in living memory, several young people left the valley without fear that their names would appear behind them. Clara traveled to a nearby town to study bookkeeping. Thomas apprenticed with a blacksmith in the next county. Edwin began saving money for a journey to the coast. They promised to return, and they did, because leaving no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like a future. On the anniversary of his arrival, Elias walked alone to the hidden basin in the mountains. The pool was still there, clear and quiet. He looked into it and saw only his own reflection. Do you still remember? He asked softly. The water rippled once, then became still again. Elias smiled. So do we. #epilogue. Many years later, travelers would speak of a mountain valley where people kept unusually detailed records of weather, harvests, dreams, and journeys. Historians would praise Gray Hollow for preserving one of the most complete local archives in Pennsylvania. They would never know why the tradition mattered so much. In the schoolhouse, an older Elias Mercer taught new generations to write clearly, observe carefully, and remember honestly. On the wall above his desk hung a simple wooden plaque. It no longer carried names or dates, only a single sentence carved by his own hand. Tomorrow belongs to those who remember it together. And beyond the windows, the river flowed through Gray Hollow, carrying not stolen futures, but the shared memory of a valley that had finally learned how to keep its own tomorrow. The story ended there. At least, that is how Elias Mercer would have written it if he had been writing for historians instead of for himself. But some endings are only the moment when a mystery stops hiding and begins changing shape. 27 years after the Winter of the Bargain, Gray Hollow had become a place that appeared on maps without argument. A proper road connected it to the neighboring county. Travelers stopped for meals at Martha Hale's Inn. Children who once feared speaking about the future now returned from colleges, workshops, and distant cities carrying stories the valley had never imagined. Elias was 59 when the first impossible thing happened. He found a name carved into a cedar tree. It was late October, the same season in which he had first arrived. The river ran low and clear between banks of red and gold leaves. Elias had walked downstream to inspect a damaged footbridge when he noticed fresh cuts in the bark. Margaret Avery, not Charlotte. Margaret, the name from the forgotten letter. Elias stared at it for a long time. The cuts were recent. Sap still glistened around the edges. His chest tightened with a feeling he could neither identify nor dismiss. He looked around the riverbank. No one was there. That evening he searched the village records until midnight. There was no Margaret Avery in Gray Hollow, no traveler by that name, no entry in the inn ledger. Yet the name would not leave him alone. When he finally slept, he dreamed of a railway station filled with steam. A woman stood at the far end of the platform, holding a book. He woke before he could see her face. The next morning, a carriage arrived from Pittsburgh. The driver handed Elias a sealed envelope. Inside was a short note. "Mr. Mercer, I believe we have a mutual acquaintance, though you may not remember her. If you are willing, please come to the Avery residence in Pittsburgh at your earliest convenience. Charlotte Avery." Elias read the note twice, then a third time. Something stirred at the edge of memory, faint as a distant bell. The journey to Pittsburgh took 2 days. Charlotte Avery greeted him at a narrow brick house overlooking the river. Time had silvered her hair, but her eyes remained sharp. "You came," she said. "I'm not entirely sure why." Charlotte studied him carefully. "No," she said softly. "I suppose you wouldn't be." She led him into a sitting room. On the table lay a photograph. A woman stood beside a train car, smiling at the camera. Elias felt the room tilt. He knew that smile. Not from memory, from absence. "Who is she?" he whispered. Charlotte's expression was gentle now. "My sister, Margaret Avery." The name struck him like a physical blow. "I know that name." "You should." Charlotte sat down across from him. "You were engaged to her." Elias could not speak. Charlotte opened a small wooden box and removed a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. "These are yours," she said. The first letter began, "My dearest Margaret, if the school board approves the transfer, I will be in Pennsylvania only one winter. When I return, we can finally begin planning our home." Elias stared at the handwriting. It was his. "I wrote this." Charlotte nodded. "You wrote dozens." His hand shook as he turned another page. "I keep thinking about the little house near the river that you liked. I know it is too small now, but perhaps someday we will laugh about that. The imagined house from the mountain pool. Not imagined. Remembered." Charlotte poured tea while Elias sat in stunned silence. "What happened to her?" he finally asked. Charlotte looked toward the window. "Influenza. February of 1888. Elias closed his eyes. He had surrendered his future in October of 1887. The river had taken his attachment to the life he intended to build. And 4 months later, Margaret Avery had died. A terrible understanding unfolded inside him. The future he had given away was not merely a possibility. It was a future that had already begun to disappear. Charlotte reached into the box and removed one final letter. "This arrived after a death," she said. "It was addressed to you, but never delivered because no one knew where Grey Hollow was." Elias unfolded it carefully. "My dear Elias, the doctor says I must rest, which gives me too much time to think. If you were here, you would insist that I stop worrying and drink the terrible tea Charlotte makes. If for some reason we do not have the future we planned, promise me something. Do not spend your life mourning a house that was never built. Build a different one. Yours always, Margaret." The letter blurred in his hands. For years, he had carried an unnamed grief, a hollow place where a future used to be. Now, the hollow had a face and a name. That evening, Charlotte walked with him along the Pittsburgh riverfront. "Did she know?" Elias asked quietly. "About Grey Hollow?" "No." Charlotte paused. "But she knew you better than anyone. After you disappeared, she kept saying that if you had chosen to stay somewhere, there must have been a reason." Elias looked at the dark water moving beneath the bridges. "I gave up our future," he said. Charlotte shook her head. "No, illness took that. Whatever happened in your valley may have taken the pain of losing it before you were ready." He had never considered that possibility. The river had not stolen Margaret from him. It had carried away the certainty that his life could exist only with her. When Elias returned to Grey Hollow, the cedar tree by the footbridge was smooth again. No trace of the carving remained. He stood there until dusk, then walked home and opened the schoolhouse desk drawer. Inside was the small wooden toy he had bought years earlier without knowing why. For the first time, he understood. It had been for a child he and Margaret once hoped to have. Elias held the toy for a long time. Then he smiled sadly and placed it on a classroom shelf where younger students kept their games for rainy days. The next morning, Edwin Cole arrived from the coast, sunburned and grinning after his first journey to the ocean. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you were right. It's bigger than anything." Elias looked at the former student standing before him, full of stories and plans. "Tell me everything," he said. And as Edwin described waves, ships, and endless horizons, Elias realized that Margaret's letter had been right all along. He had not spent his life mourning a house that was never built. He had built a different one. It stood beside a river in a valley that had once feared tomorrow. Its rooms were filled with students, laughter, records, memories, and futures that belonged to their owners. And somewhere, beyond all the possibilities the river had ever remembered, he hoped Margaret Avery knew that the promise had been kept. Grey Hollow did not lose its teacher that autumn, but it gained something it had never truly possessed before. A past that no longer needed to be surrendered in order for the future to survive. And from that year onward, when travelers asked why the people of Grey Hollow kept such careful records of weather, journeys, births, and dreams, the villagers would smile and answer, "Because tomorrow is easier to carry when everyone helps remember it." Another 10 years passed before the river spoke again. By then, Elias Mercer was an old man with white hair and careful hands. The children he had first taught were parents themselves. Grey Hollow had changed beyond anything the frightened village of 1887 could have imagined. A telegraph line reached the valley. A small library stood beside the church. Travelers came not because the town was hidden, but because it was known for its records, its school, and the strange calm that seemed to settle over anyone who stayed a few days. Elias had long since stopped expecting mysteries. That was why the sound startled him. Not a bell, not a voice, a knock. 3 slow knocks on the schoolhouse door after midnight. Elias opened it expecting a traveler caught in the rain. Nathan Bell stood on the porch, older than before, not ghostly, not made of mist, simply a man in a dark coat holding a lantern. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Nathan said, "May I come in?" Elias stepped aside. Nathan removed his hat and looked around the classroom. New desks, fresh paint, shelves of books, maps on the walls. "You kept teaching," he said. "You expected me to stop?" A faint smile touched Nathan's face. "I hoped you wouldn't." Elias poured 2 cups of coffee with hands steadier than he felt. "I thought you were gone." "So did I." Nathan accepted the cup. "When the bargain changed, the river released us. Most of the others faded completely. I didn't. Why? Nathan looked into the coffee. Because I had somewhere to return to. Elias frowned. But everyone believed you disappeared. I did. For 12 years. Nathan's voice was quiet. When I finally found my way out of the mountains, the world had moved on. The school in Columbus had replaced me. My family thought I was dead. What did you do? I became a teacher again. The answer was so simple that Elias laughed despite himself. Of course you did. They talked until dawn. Nathan told him about small towns across Pennsylvania, where he had taught reading and arithmetic under assumed names. He never stayed long. Every few years he felt drawn back toward the mountains, as if checking whether the river still needed him. And now, Elias asked, now I think I finally understand why it kept me. Nathan set down his cup. There's something you should see. They walked to the river as the eastern sky began to pale. The water flowed normally. Nathan pointed to the opposite bank. Look carefully. At first Elias saw only cedars and morning mist. Then he noticed a small figure standing among the trees. A boy of about 10. Dark hair. Thin coat. Watching the river. Whose child is that? Elias asked. No one's, Nathan said. The boy stepped forward. Elias's breath caught. He knew that face. Not from Gray Hollow. From an old photograph in Pittsburgh. The imagined child from the mountain pool. The son he and Margaret Avery had once hoped for. The boy raised a hand in greeting. Then the morning mist drifted across the bank, and he was gone. Elias stood motionless. What was that? Nathan's expression was unreadable. A remembered possibility. The river can still do that. Not often, and not for everyone. Nathan looked at him. When we change a bargain, the source stopped taking futures. But it kept the ones that had already been surrendered. Elias felt the old ache, gentler now than it had once been. Why show me? Because you spent 37 years believing that future was lost. Nathan turned toward the water. The source wanted you to know it was remembered. They walked upstream in silence. Near the footbridge, Nathan stopped. I won't be staying, he said. Where will you go? There are other valleys. Other towns that forget how to imagine tomorrow. Elias studied him. You become a keeper after all. Nathan shook his head. No, just a teacher. He handed Elias a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside was the silver pocket watch found beside the river in 1887. The hands moved steadily now. I think it belongs here, Nathan said. Before leaving, he paused on the bridge. One more thing, he said. The source asked me to tell you something. Elias waited. Nathan smiled faintly. It says thank you for teaching it the difference between keeping a future and carrying one. Then he crossed the bridge and disappeared into the morning mist. Elias never saw him again. Years later, when Elias himself was near the end of his life, Edwin Cole found him sitting beside the river with the silver watch in his lap. You look tired, Edwin said. I am. The former student sat beside him. Do you ever regret staying here? Elias watched the water for a long time. Once, I thought regret meant wishing for a different life, he said. Now, I think it means refusing to see the value of the one you have. Edwin nodded thoughtfully. The ocean taught me something similar. Elias smiled. Then perhaps I taught you well. That evening he returned to the schoolhouse and placed the silver watch in a glass case beside the old wooden plaque. Under it he wrote a final note. This watch stopped when one future was surrendered. It began again when many people chose to remember together. Below the note, he added the date. October 29th, 1926. When Elias Mercer died the following spring, the entire valley walked beside the river carrying lanterns. No names appeared on the trees. No papers rose from the water. The river flowed quietly as the villagers buried their teacher on a hill overlooking the schoolhouse. Edwin Cole, now headmaster, read aloud from one of Elias's lessons. History is not the study of what is gone. It is the study of what we choose to carry forward. After the service, a small boy approached the grave and asked his mother, was Mr. Mercer famous? She looked at the river, the schoolhouse, and the generations gathered around them. No, she said softly. He was something rarer. He taught a valley how to stop being afraid of tomorrow. Long after everyone had gone home, The river caught the last light of sunset. For a brief moment, two reflections appeared on its surface. An old teacher standing beside a woman with a kind smile. Then the current moved on, carrying the image gently into evening. And in Gray Hollow, where tomorrow had once belonged to a river, it finally belonged to the people who were willing to remember it together. The end.